So everybody, the M2 iPad Air, which is probably Apple's weirdest accumulation or combination of specs and hardware for any iPad in the iPad lineup. Let's talk about it. So for this M2 iPad Air review, I really tried my best to put this thing through its paces because I wanted to find out and answer the question of who is this M2 iPad Air for, especially the larger 13-inch model, which is one that I have been using. Because now when you look at the iPad lineup, if you're looking at it just from a brand new iPad standpoint, you have the iPad 10th generation, which did get a reduction in price. You have the iPad mini, you have the 11-inch iPad Air, the new M2 version. You now have the 13-inch iPad Air, you have the 11-inch new M4 iPad Pro, and then the 13-inch M4 iPad Pro as well. And now this M2 iPad Air is kind of sitting in the middle, and it's hard to find out exactly who the target demographic is, but I think I did find out exactly who this particular iPad is for, so definitely stick around for the end of the video or just skip ahead. But let's start off with the actual design of this M2 iPad Air. And for all intents and purposes, this is a 2018 iPad Pro. It has the same exact design language, the same chassis. The only real differences that you're going to see is going to be from color choices, right? Because back then, you only had space gray and silver as the iPad Pro color, versus now with the iPad Air, it's known as Apple's more colorful line, so you can decide on different colors. You do have iPad Air on the rear of it, so you do get the iPad Air moniker as opposed to just it saying iPad, and you get some additional speaker grills on it as well. Again, it doesn't translate to better sound or anything, but visually it is different. And then lastly, if you are really looking at it, you do get a larger lock button because of the Touch ID sensor versus the Face ID sensor that we have on all the iPad Pros from 2018 and newer. So that's exactly what I think Apple did. Apple had a bunch of these 2018 iPad Pro chassis, and all they did was throw a nice paint color on it, and now they revamped it and put the new internals in it of an M2 chip and called it the brand new M2 iPad Air. But one key difference, which we'll touch on a little bit later, is going to be the ProMotion versus the regular IPS panel that's on the 60Hz M2 iPad Air. But the good news about it being kind of the same exact design is if you do have a bunch of old iPad Pro accessories laying around, for the most part, unless it's something that's covering the actual rim around it and kind of covers a Touch ID sensor, they're going to work. So if you have any magnet-based accessories, whether it is the Magic Keyboard, even the Slim Folio keyboard, from a first-party standpoint, but even third-party accessories like the stand that I have behind me, it still attaches with the same accessories as the old iPad Pros because the magnet array is identical to those iPads from 2018 all the way to 2022. So again, if you're coming maybe from a 2018 iPad Pro and you're upgrading to the new iPad Air and you have a bunch of accessories laying around, just rest assured that it will work. And then to continue on with the different accessories that work with the brand new M2 iPad Air, when it comes to the Apple Pencil, the new Apple Pencil Pro is compatible with the new M2 iPad Air, as well as the USB-C Apple Pencil. So if you do have an Apple Pencil 2 laying around, unfortunately it will not work, and the reason is because Apple did squeeze in the selfie camera in the actual landscape orientation, and supposedly the way that they kind of set that up, rearrange the magnets and rearrange the charging situation, so the Apple Pencil 2 unfortunately does not work with the new M2 iPad Air. And the last thing I do want to mention before we get into the actual use cases of the M2 iPad Air is going to be spec configuration. So previously we were only able to go from 64 gigs to 256 in terms of upgrading the internal storage, but now we do have a 128 gig starting option and it goes all the way to 1 terabyte. But one thing I will mention that if you do go for an iPad Pro with a 1 terabyte or higher SSD, you do get an additional 8 gigs of RAM. But with the iPad Air, even if you do go with the 1 terabyte fully loaded 13-inch M2 iPad Air, you will still be restricted to just 8 gigs of unified memory. Depending on who you are, that's going to be more than enough, especially with iPadOS and how you use iPad Air, but something you should consider if you were looking to maybe find an iPad Air with 16 gigs of RAM. So because I knew that I was going to keep my M4 iPad Pro long term, I decided to go into the M2 iPad Air and see if it was a worthy enough upgrade coming from the M1 iPad Pro, because I think that this is kind of a situation where people will be coming from perhaps maybe even an older iPad Pro like a 2020 or a 2018 iPad Pro, and they want to upgrade to the new M2 chip because it is a little bit faster and they give you a little bit more performance gains. But if you are coming from an older iPad Pro that has something like that 120Hz ProMotion, you're going to immediately feel the difference on this display. Now, if you're not coming from a ProMotion display, then you're not going to really tell the difference, and this LCD IPS panel that Apple's had for years and years is still going to be awesome, right? It's still a 60Hz display, it's still very bright, it's still able to handle everything that you throw at it. You just will notice if you have experienced ProMotion that it is a little bit slower, right? The animations move a little bit slower, opening applications aren't as quick and on the ready as it would be with a ProMotion 120Hz display, so that is kind of the biggest difference from an iPad Pro to this M2 iPad Air. It is the display tech, especially if you're going with an M1 or M2 iPad Pro, you get the mini LED display, so it's even much brighter, and then obviously with the M4, you get OLED, so that is kind of where your money is being saved. It's going to be on the display tech from the 120Hz to 60, and then also going from either a mini LED down to an IPS LCD panel. But even though I'm saying that, it still works perfectly fine with the Apple Pencil Pro. It still supports hover. You still get all the cool functionality from the Apple Pencil Pro that you would get with the M4 iPad Pro. So from a feature standpoint, there isn't really any differentiation at that point because you can use the Apple Pencil Pro and use it to its full capacity on the M2 iPad Air. Like, there isn't a substantial lag behind it. You still get that 9 millisecond response time on the Apple Pencil. So from a screen standpoint, if you're a designer, this is still going to be good enough, and you're just not going to get that 120 Hz ProMotion that I keep mentioning. And then internally, you do get the M2 chip, so you will be getting some performance gains depending on what you're coming from. Like, I was able to export a LumaFusion file a little bit faster on the M2 iPad Air versus my M1 iPad Pro from before, and it did kind of export probably 10% faster. I only did it with a 1-minute clip, so if you kind of extend that all the way to a 10 or 15-minute clip, then it will save you a decent amount of time. But again, it's not going to be night and day, especially if you aren't doing anything that task intensive. If you're doing just the regular iPad stuff like browsing the web, watching YouTube videos, some content consumption, some digital note-taking, all the things that you would use an iPad for kind of to throw around the house. Maybe you're on Pinterest and scrolling through Instagram and things like that. The M2 iPad Air is going to be more than enough to handle all of those kind of functions and tasks, and it also gives you those M-exclusive feature sets like Stage Manager. Another hardware piece to consider is the USB-C port. This is a USB 3 port, so it does give you those data transfer speeds of up to 10 gigabytes per second, so that is plenty fast for most people if you want to plug in a dongle or a USB-C hub and transfer some photos or some video, but you won't be getting those Thunderbolt speeds that you do get with something like an M1, M2, or now the M4 iPad Pro. With that USB-C port, you can fast charge your iPad Air. It comes with a 20-watt brick in the box, but it does support up to 33 watts of fast charging, and it supports up to 18 watts of charging if you are connected to something like the Magic Keyboard, which again is more than enough if you are looking to quickly charge your iPad. But when it comes to all those other tasks, like being able to do some business tasks, maybe some personal finance tasks, whatever the case may be, whatever you threw at it, because it does have that M2 chip, and we already know that the M2 chip on an iPad works extremely well. Again, this is the same exact story. It works extremely well, and for that price point, right? If you even go with the 11-inch model, the M2 chip, I believe at $600, is the cheapest price point to get an M2 capable machine overall. So if you look at it from that perspective, then it is a bargain, but at the end of the day, it still is an iPad. And now the last thing I do want to bring up is battery life. I will say that because of the size of this iPad, as well as the actual screen tech that isn't really taking up a lot of horsepower and taking up a lot of juice, the battery life on the 13-inch M2 iPad Air is amazing. The iPad Air lasts me 10 to 12 hours no problem, watching 4K content, as well as also editing in LumaFusion and using things like Affinity Photo. I was able to use the iPad Air over and over again without needing to plug it in, which is something that I really could not say with my M1 iPad Pro, especially as the years went on. By the end of the time that I had my iPad Pro, I was getting maybe 3 or 4 hours of intense use, versus with the iPad Air, I was still getting about 8 hours of intense task use with the iPad Air because of the fact that it's not pushing all those pixels like it does with a mini LED display or 120 Hz panel. So if you're looking for the battery king iPad, the M2 13-inch iPad Air is going to be the way to go if that's the only thing that you're looking for. But that is a great segue into kind of talking about who this M2 iPad Air is for, right? And I had to put it probably in a couple buckets here. There's only a few reasons why I would recommend an M2 iPad Air over anything else, right? Because for the most part, I'm a believer in getting a used M1 iPad Pro or refurbished M2 iPad Pro because the price point's going to be the same, if not cheaper. Sometimes if you do find a used iPad Pro and Apple's not taking in trade-ins for things like the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil 2, people will just bundle it all in there and you can find great price points for these used iPad Pros because of that fact. So I'm always telling people, look at the refurbished market, look at the used market, because you get a lot more bang for your buck from a hardware and internal spec perspective than you would with something like the M2 iPad Air. Because the M2 iPad Air at that 13-inch size still costs you $800 as a starting point, then you still have to buy the $350 Magic Keyboard if you do want to go that route, and the $130 Apple Pencil Pro, so at the end of the day, you're still spending over $1,000 on a budget iPad, which is that 13-inch M2 iPad Air. So those $1,000 can go way farther in the used market, and that's always what I end up telling people. So there's only really 3 buckets that I can kind of put this on when it comes to who should buy a brand new M2 iPad Air. First is going to be that person that likes to price shop around but only looks at buying new things and they don't really want to mess with the used market, which I totally understand because you don't know how people have treated things in the past and maybe the battery life isn't amazing. That's why I usually go refurbished over totally used from somebody else, but that will be the first bucket. Bucket number 2 is going to be that you want the cheapest price point to get and be able to use that Apple Pencil Pro, because as of right now, the $600 11-inch iPad Air is the cheapest way to use the Apple Pencil Pro and is also the cheapest entry point to that M2 chip. So those are really the only 2 and 3 buckets that I can kind of see people going for this or recommending this iPad over a used iPad Pro because they want to use the Apple Pencil Pro or they don't really like to buy used things to begin with. But that is just my 2 cents when it comes to the M2 iPad Air over something like a used iPad Pro, and that is my 2 cents on the M2 iPad Air to begin with. In a silo, the M2 iPad Air is a great iPad. It can kind of do everything that the older iPad Pros did, including even what the current new M4 iPad Pro can do. It supports the latest in terms of the Apple Pencil Pro. It's able to kind of accomplish everything from a spec perspective and software perspective. So if it's just in a silo by itself, the M2 iPad Air is a great iPad. It's just that when you see everything else that's around you and the different price points and the used market, the refurbished market, it is really tough to recommend that iPad to anybody over, let's say, an iPad Pro, over something like an iPad Pro, or even yet a used M1 iPad Air at the 11-inch size. But that's going to do it for this video, everybody. If you made it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And let me know in the comment down below, are you somebody that wants to get the iPad Air? Why would you get the iPad Air? I'm very genuinely curious, and I want to discuss this in the comments down below. But if you guys want to watch more videos like this one, click on one of these right here. And until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm out of here, everybody. Peace.